Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for National Poetry Month. My name is Adam Pelche, and I am very pleased to be joined by our local poet and all-around wonderful human being, Vanessa Shields. She is an incredible writer and a very prolific poet as well, who I could list off her accolades, and it would take at least half an hour. But one of my very favorite things to do with Vanessa is talk poetry, and there's plenty to speak about. In addition to releasing her most recent book, Thimbles, you can also go back many years and find other publications such as I Am That Woman and look at her, amongst others. Vanessa, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me. Yay. Happy
So,
National Poetry Month.
yes, happy National Poetry Month. I'm very excited to be speaking with you. We have spoken in the past, but I always love coming back, having more conversations. Before we go on to the actual conversation, I'm wondering if you would be able to start off by reading a poem of yours for us.
For sure. So this one's, all of the ones that I read today are hot off the press. Uh, there are a couple of drafts in, potentially will be changing in the future, but that's the state of where these poems are. It's still kind of in flux and moving. But here we go. The first one's called The Meeting. I meet poetry on the sofa. She watches me stuff my mouth with sour cream and onion chips, watches me tear open a snack pack of Sunkist fruit chews that are supposed to be for the kids' lunches, watches me stuff and chew, watches me binge in between thoughts of body hate and guilt for everything. Everything is fat with reckoning. I don't want to play in the schoolyard anymore, I tell poetry. Bullies are abundant, more powerful than ever, crueler than fist fights. At least in the old days, I could face the bully, try to stand up for myself, a teacher always nearby, a principal ready for discussion and discipline. There's none of that here, I tell poetry. So I'm always scared, always censoring, always doing semantic gymnastics. My flexibility is waning. My cells are waxing, worried, and wrestling with the past demons that claw and drag. Poetry shifts, faces me, takes the chips away, the fruit snacks, tosses the junk over its shoulder. Immediately I begin to cry, sputter, and spit. Poetry reaches into me, holds my wounds in its grace. It's okay, says poetry. It's okay.
Thank you so much. As with that poem, with so much of your work, there are a lot of personal aspects in it. I'm wondering, is writing poetry therapeutic for you?
Absolutely. Really, it's the meeting place, the space where I go to, stay connected with my soul and my heart and all of the festering wounds. And so it's really special for me that I have that relationship with poetry to be able to express myself. But at the same time, it's a good place to avoid as well. And really, I haven't been writing poetry for quite some time. And so this kind of new work that I'm doing, the voice is a little bit different. The subject matter is a little bit different, though it is still very personal. I feel like a big change is happening in the way that I write and the way that I express myself. And so I'm really playing with that and kind of welcoming poetry back into my life in this new way. And also, feeling like my long lost friend has come back from, being away, or I went away and now we're reconnecting. So this is kind of the world, the poetry world that I'm in right now. And that's how I'm rebuilding my confidence as a poet and kind of reshaping my voice to deal with, some personal things that have happened to me in the last 6 to 8 months, which included me kind of fully stepping away from writing poetry. So coming back to it now, and it's different. It's different and new and exciting and scary, but certainly feels good to be back with it in my life.
This does lead to my next question, which is about process, because
Yeah.
really everyone I speak with this month, we're touching upon their process and about how it changes and advances. Because, as you said, your style has changed significantly. Even when I look at something like I Am That Woman, going towards thimbles, there was huge changes. And now I'm seeing more changes in what you've shared. What does your process look like now when you go to compose poetry?
So I suppose one thing that has remained the same is I'll get a line, like two or three words or a full line or an image, sometimes a metaphor, that begins the inspiration to write. Whether or not that actually ends up in the poem could happen or not happen, but there's usually an initial idea, like a seeing in that, our movie mind, the words kind of dance through or an image shows up. Um, and if I'm paying attention to that, I'll remember it, I'll write it down. I still like to handwrite my poems first, which is, a process that I've been doing since I was a little girl. And then I'll move it and type it into the computer. And so the first kind of step of editing will happen from the transition from the handwritten page to typing it up on the computer. Then I'll read it out loud. There's usually some editing that happens there. Though that kind of process remains the same, I think the sort of quickness of the inspiration or the amount of images and connection to those lines and those words in my brain, that has definitely shifted over because I've just kind of turned it off, which I didn't know I could do, which was terrifying to, as a poet, know that I could just say, I'm not writing that right now. But I think I needed to do that in order to work on some other healing, and writing in my journal and doing kind of prose writing, reading a lot, exercising, praying, meditating, kind of having to move around the way that I deal with my emotions. Whereas before, I would immediately, my instinct would be to write a poem. That's definitely shifted now. I don't know if it's also aging, and my relationship with my body is different. I got sick, so I had to kind of deal with that. There was kind of like an amalgamation of a lot of changes that happened to me all at once in the last 6 months, and that changed my relationship to poetry. So I just kind of put her aside. Now I'm apologizing and reconnecting. But the actual process of how it works in my body kind of remains the same, although it's not my go-to self-expression right now. That's a little bit different.
Would you be able to talk about that? What your go-to self-expression is?
Sure. I talk a lot. I have a really wonderful group of writer friends all over Canada, locally. So I do a lot of talking about my feelings, talking about my anger, sharing my own experiences and feeling not alone in those experiences. That's been really helpful and important. Writing wise, I write in my journal. I've filled probably 3 journals in the last 6 months, which is rare. Usually it takes me about 3 months to do one, but I'm writing out a lot in that regard. And it's still a kind of a conversation, which is my poetry, I like to think, is very conversational. But yeah, it's still conversational, but it's, full sentences, pages and pages of writing. And so really between the talking and the writing in my journal, those are my go-tos right now for how I'm expressing myself and working on my creativity.
What you talk about and what you write, does that ever make its way into your poems?
Um, yes, although it's slow right now, because I'm still working through a lot of the stuff, and some things are private, some things I'm not ready to share quite yet, which is different for me because I've written about everything, kids, sex, flowers. I really didn't have any not issues, but like concerns with privacy. Like I feel like I'll write about anything. now I'm a little more cautious with what I write about and how I communicate how I'm feeling. And again, I'm not quite sure what that is from. It's a mixture of, what I went through last year, the kind of the literary landscape right now, aging, maturing, if you will. So I think that's part of, why what I'm writing about changes, and just my relationship to things that I do want to keep more private at this time. But that might change. It probably will change once I know exactly what I want to say and how I want to say it, and with the confidence to put it out into the world. That's definitely a part of me that's been affected recently, is how I feel about the actual sharing. And I'm kind of rebuilding my confidence and my love and passion of poetry, and my trust in its purpose, and trust in that intention counts when I'm sharing. So, but I'm cautious. I'm cautious right now.
Because one thing I do want to say is that throughout all of your writing, I've always found your poetry to be very brave. As you said before, you've touched upon so many things: childbirth, you've talked about motherhood, you've talked about issues with the body, you've talked about death in thimbles, sex. I feel there's a lot of people who I speak with who are burgeoning creative writers, and they feel a little bit of intimidation. There's only so much they're willing to share, and then they feel there's a threshold.
Yeah.
To anyone who's kind of coming against that wall, would you have any advice or anything you would like to share to writers who maybe feel they can't go beyond a certain level of comfortability?
Sure. I mean, I would say go with that and trust that. I mean, there's a really powerful connection between our creativity and our intuition and our voice. And, if you're not ready to write about something and share it, because there's sort of two parts to that, right? We can write about anything. If nobody sees it, there is no threshold, and it belongs to us. But if we're going to share it, I think that's when those kind of questions and those thresholds, those protections, those walls, whatever word you want to use to describe that, show up for us. But I would say, your partnership with creativity and poetry in this case, there's a trust, like there is between friends, like there is between you and I. We trust that this is a safe space that we can talk and share in. And if you don't feel that safety or you don't feel prepared to deal with the possibilities of what will happen when people read your work, then I would say just wait and continue to build that trust within yourself so that you're prepared for what happens when you put it out there. But the writing itself before it gets shared, for me, I don't have anything holding me back. And I think that's what enables me to have such a kind of vibrant, creative life. And that's always been really helpful for me. So when I do have whatever courage shows up and I'm ready to, share a poem about sex or menstruation or boobs, whatever, I'm ready. I'm prepared. The poem and I are ready. I'm prepared to put it into the world and, deal with whoever might respond to it.
Not to universalize it, but I've always argued that poetry is a very intimate form of communication.
I agree. Yep. Yeah.
I think there's so much shared. As you said, it's like a conversation with someone, and it's more than just a story. It's a series of impressions, a series of ideas or emotions. I'm just wondering, have you experienced lately diving into any poetry that you really felt that intimate connection with yourself?
Yeah. So one of my favorite poets right now, living poets, her name is Rosemary Watola Tromer, and she writes a poem every day, and it comes in my inbox, my email. And she's someone who inspires me every day. Her piece always seems to fit something that's happening, like the magic of poetry has in her energy. It always matches whatever I'm feeling or going through that day. It's very human. It's very natural. It's very raw and intimate. And she's just a constant reminder of that kind of poetry, like that's what poetry can be. That's what poetry can hold. She and I share the idea of poetry as a meeting space and a meeting place for our emotions and, life. So I read her poetry every day, and she reminds me how to be courageous in the way that she writes.
And I just have one last question, and this is more hopefully geared towards those who are interested in writing poetry, who maybe love reading it but are uncertain, maybe a little bit trepidatious about sharing what
Sure.
they have or even putting pen to paper. Just for anyone who might be hesitant to start writing their own or explore writing poetry, what advice would you give to those individuals?
Sure. So the first thing is read poetry. Where do you find poetry? Well, on all our favorite social media locations. There are some amazing Instagram poets out there. If you go to YouTube and you Google poetry or poetry slams, which is where people get up and kind of compete with their poems, you can listen to poetry and watch poetry. There's the League of Canadian Poets has a very robust website filled with lots of poetry by Canadian poets. Yes, there's another wonderful Canadian online poetry group called Poetry and Voice, and they have loads of poetry and also writing prompts. So, I mean, the internet is a great friend too. If you just Google poetry prompts or reading poetry, there's millions of places to go. But I would say read poetry. And then I would say, in terms of process, I would say, copy some of the poems that you like, copy the format, take a line from a poem you love and start your own poem from that. And then, go outside, be in nature and pay attention. Just listen, use your senses, smell, hear, touch, taste, and just pay attention to what your body does in whatever environment that you're in and see if you feel compelled to write about it. I wouldn't worry too much about form. Really, just the practice of getting the words out is a really important part of writing poetry. And then you can play with how it looks on the page and play with formatting afterwards. But read poetry and then, use your senses to pay attention. And I mean, nature is just a wonderful space to be in to kind of start that process. Because I don't know about you, but I'm like always so affected when I go outside in any way. Although if people don't want to go outside because it's cold or rainy or whatever, I mean, any kind of art that's around you, listen to music and pay attention to how the lyrics make you feel, dance, eat food. Writing about food is wonderful fun. Writing about your body, wonderful fun too. So, I mean, for me, there's no shortage of things to write about, but, learning how is through reading. That's really how I learned. And that's everything from like Dr. Seuss to Leonard Cohen to, your favorite musician. Lyrics are essentially a form of poetry. So it's all around us if we pay attention.
Thank you, Vanessa. I really hope that advice reaches someone who could use it because I think that is wonderful advice.
Thank
And
you.
you're welcome. And just to end off the conversation, I'm wondering if you would be willing to read another poem of yours for the audience.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this one is called I Will Walk My Lobster With You. And so part of my morning kind of spiritual ritual is I have this book by Patti Smith called The Book of Days. And it's her Instagram pictures that she took for a year during COVID. And there's a beautiful picture and then a really cool, like, poetic write up. She's such a lovely writer, Patti Smith. Read Patti Smith, I would say, absolutely. Anyway, so I don't remember what day it was, but she had a picture of a poet, French poet named, I forget his first name, I'm sorry, but his last name is Nerval. And he wrote this, he was in a insane asylum. If I don't know if that's what they're called anymore, but that's what they were called at the time. And he had a lobster and he would walk this lobster, like a literal red lobster on a leash. And so I read some of his poems, which were just lovely. And so I was like double inspired by her and by him and by this idea of walking a lobster. So this is the poem that came after that. It's called I Will Walk My Lobster With You, for Nerval, with thanks to Patti Smith. Oh, tender nerves, electric shrivel of hope, we must all stick our finger in the socket of despair, fold into chaos and tame the furies in our worlds. Like weather, they come at us, winds that break backs, the weight of their change excruciating. We must walk our fears like we walk our lobsters, slowly, with conscious caution, a pretty blue ribbon around their necks for connection. It is because we are alive that we can hold hysteria. If we do not take her hand, she will take our souls and melt us into pools of shame. What is crazy but the soul growing arms and legs, lungs and heart, so to lift herself out of the depths of death? We do not want to die, and so we conduct the symphony of our mortality with desperate crescendos, bloodied, until we understand that lobster is alive too, that mobility in mind, body, and spirit is death's poison. There you go.
Is beautiful. Vanessa,
Thank you.
your new poems are excellent, and I am so glad and I feel privileged to have a chance to hear them. I would recommend everyone who is watching this check out Vanessa's poetry. There are many places to do that. Of course, Windsor Public Library, we carry all of her works.
Yes.
And Vanessa, where else can people check out your work at?
So yeah, local bookstores, online at my website, vanessashields.com. Yeah, those are kind of the main places. A little bit on Instagram, which my Instagram is Shields Vanessa. And that's the only place I am really right now online. All of those places.
Excellent. Once again, Vanessa, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know if you know this or if it's going to get talked about, but the theme for at least the League of Canadian Poets National Poetry Month is joy. So I offer joy to everybody. Joy in reading poetry, joy in writing poetry, and enjoy the month. Thank you for reading poetry and talking about poetry.